The helicopter blades slice through Arizona night air, carrying two people toward a story they think they understand. Blake Langermann adjusts his camera one more time, checking battery levels, while his wife, Lynn, reviews notes about a pregnant woman found murdered in the desert, dumped like trash, where no one was meant to find her. They're journalists chasing truth, believers in exposure as justice, convinced that shining light into dark places makes those places less dangerous. Within the hour, their helicopter will fall from the sky. Lynn will be taken by people who believe she's carrying the Antichrist, and Blake will descend into memories of a childhood trauma he's spent 20 years trying to forget. By the time the sun rises, one of them will be dead, holding a baby that may or may not exist, while the other cradles her body and watches the world burn. This is Outlast 2. The story of how a corporation turned faith into weapon, how guilt becomes indistinguishable from reality, and how the apocalypse looks when it's broadcast directly into your brain. We're going to walk through every layer of this nightmare. We'll meet Sullivan Knoth, the failed businessman who heard God through radio static and built a cult in the wilderness. We'll follow Blake and Lynn as they crash into Temple Gate, a settlement caught between warring interpretations of the end times. We'll witness the Scald, the heretics, and the Testament faithful as they tear each other apart under the influence of something they can't see or understand. And we'll unravel the truth about Jessica Gray, the girl who died at the bottom of a stairwell when Blake was 14, whose death has been waiting in his mind like a loaded gun for 2 decades, ready to fire the moment someone pulled the trigger. By the end, you'll understand what Murkoff Corporation was testing in those Arizona mountains, why Lynn's pregnancy defied biological possibility, and what it means when the woman you love dies, telling you there's nothing there. If this sounds like the kind of deep dive you're here for, go ahead and hit that like button so other fans can find their way to this video. And drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing our late night community checking in from every time zone. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let's begin. The truth holding this entire story together is simple. Outlast 2 asks one question: what happens when the monster hunting you is your own guilt? Amplified and weaponized by people who learned how to make trauma profitable. Keep that question in mind. Everything we're about to examine connects back to it. Chapter 1. The Prophet Who Heard God on the Radio. Sullivan Knoth was failing when God found him. Picture Albuquerque, New Mexico, 1966. Sullivan Knoth is a shoe salesman drowning in debt, on the verge of losing everything and clinging to late-night evangelical radio for comfort. He'd borrowed money from family to keep his shoe sales business afloat, made promises about returns that now sound like fantasies, and spent the last 6 months watching his dream collapse into bankruptcy. The radio plays while he calculates how many weeks until creditors file lawsuits, how many months until he loses everything, how many years it might take to recover from failure this comprehensive. Then the radio speaks to him. That's how Knoth describes it in his writings, which Blake discovers scattered throughout Temple Gate. The voice didn't interrupt the program or override the signal. It came through the music, between the static, underneath the late-night talk show host's rambling, a voice that told Sullivan Knoth that he'd been chosen, that worldly failure meant nothing because his true purpose was spiritual, that the end of days approached, and he alone possessed the clarity to guide others through the coming tribulation. Most people hearing voices through radios seek psychiatric help. Knoth heard validation. He abandoned his failing business within a week, left behind debts, relationships, and any connection to the life he'd been failing at. He started preaching on street corners, handing out pamphlets about revelation and rapture, finding others who felt displaced by modernity and disconnected from institutions that seemed increasingly hostile to faith. His message was tailored for people who felt left behind, people angry at cultural changes they didn't understand, frightened by social movements that threatened familiar hierarchies, desperate for someone to tell them their resentment was righteousness. Knoth's theology drew heavily from the Book of Revelation, but filtered through his own paranoid interpretation. He taught that the world had already fallen, that secular society worshipped Satan without knowing it, that children born in this corrupted age were vessels for demonic corruption. The only path to salvation required complete separation from the fallen world, physical isolation, where the faithful could prepare for the tribulations ahead. Over the following years, Knoth gathered followers and ultimately led them into the wilderness near Supai in northern Arizona, where he founded Templegate. The area was perfect for his purposes, remote, surrounded by mountains, accessible only through rough terrain that discouraged casual visitors. He named the settlement Templegate, a threshold between the fallen world and the purified community of believers. The early years of Templegate resembled many religious communes of the 1970s. Members pooled resources, built structures from available materials, established routines of work and worship. Children were homeschooled according to Knoth's interpretation of Scripture. Contact with the outside world was minimal and controlled. Members who questioned teachings were counseled privately, then publicly, rebuked if private correction failed, then expelled if rebellion persisted. Knoth positioned himself as prophet rather than mere pastor. He claimed ongoing revelation directly from God, new scriptures that expanded and clarified biblical prophecy. His followers transcribed his pronouncements into a text called the Testament of the New Ezekiel, which gradually replaced traditional scripture as the settlement's primary religious document. The Testament's teachings grew increasingly apocalyptic and violent, describing in explicit detail how the faithful must respond when the Antichrist arrived. Families who joined Templegate often did so, seeking escape from financial problems, from broken relationships, from legal troubles, from lives that felt purposeless and hollow. Knoth offered meaning, structure, belonging, and certainty in exchange for absolute obedience. For people desperate enough, that trade seemed reasonable. The settlement persisted for decades with minimal outside awareness. Occasionally someone would leave, would show up in a nearby town with stories about authoritarian control and disturbing rituals, but without evidence of immediate danger. Authorities treated Templegate as just another isolated religious group. America has thousands of such communities, existing on the margins, protected by religious freedom statutes and geographic isolation. What nobody outside Templegate understood was how completely Knoth controlled every aspect of life within the settlement. He selected marriages, deciding which men would be paired with which women based on spiritual fitness rather than affection or compatibility. He administered punishments for infractions ranging from questioning his teachings to failing to display sufficient enthusiasm during worship. He controlled information, dictating what members knew about the outside world, filtering news through his apocalyptic framework so every external event became evidence of coming tribulation. Women in Templegate occupied the lowest tier of the hierarchy. They were expected to be silent, obedient, and constantly available for reproductive purposes. Knoth taught that women were spiritually weaker, more susceptible to demonic influence, responsible for original sin, and therefore requiring constant male oversight. He also taught that their primary spiritual purpose was producing children who could be raised righteously, vessels for the next generation of the faithful. The reality was considerably darker. Documents discovered throughout the game reveal that Knoth sexually abused many women in the settlement, justifying this as spiritual leadership, claiming these encounters were necessary to maintain his prophetic anointing. Women who resisted or reported his abuse were publicly humiliated as liars or demons. sometimes punished physically, always isolated from community support. Knoth fathered many children through his abuse of Templegate women. Some of these children were raised with special attention, groomed as potential heirs to his prophetic authority. But when the visions began intensifying, Knoth turned against even his own offspring, seeing corruption everywhere, trusting no one. For 4 decades, Templegate existed in this state, abusive, isolated, apocalyptic, but contained. The faithful grew older. Children were born and raised into beliefs they never chose. And Sullivan Knoth continued hearing God's voice through the radio, receiving revelations that always seemed to justify expanding his control. Then in 2013, something changed. Knoth began receiving visions that went beyond his usual apocalyptic fantasies. These weren't metaphorical images he could interpret flexibly. These were specific, vivid, overwhelming experiences that left him convinced the tribulation had finally begun. He saw demons walking among the faithful. He witnessed children transforming into monstrous forms. He experienced the sensation of reality itself, becoming unstable, as though the boundary between the material and spiritual realms was dissolving. What Knoth didn't know was that his visions had nothing to do with God. They had everything to do with radio towers that Murkoff Corporation had recently activated in the mountains surrounding Templegate. Towers broadcasting a signal derived from the same technology that created the Walrider at Mount Massive Asylum. Murkoff had found a new way to test the morphogenic engine's potential, and Sullivan Knoth's isolated cult of believers was about to become the largest field experiment in weaponized trauma ever conducted. But before we can understand what Murkoff did to Templegate, we need to understand what brought Blake and Lynn Langermann to Arizona in the first place, and what memory Blake has been running from since he was 14 years old. The visions Knoth experienced weren't unique to him. That's the detail that should make you uncomfortable. Every single person in Templegate started experiencing the same intrusive, violent hallucinations around the same time, and that synchronicity reveals something about human consciousness that Murkoff Corporation had learned to exploit. Chapter 2: The Journalist and the Memory That Hunts Him. Blake Langermann is 27 years old when the helicopter goes down. He's built a decent career as a cameraman working with his wife Lynn, who handles investigation and reporting while Blake captures footage that brings her stories to life. They've covered corruption cases, environmental disasters, human rights violations, stories that require going into dangerous places where people don't want cameras recording their actions. The Jane Doe case began with a body discovered in the Arizona desert in northern Arizona, not far from where Templegate was hidden. A pregnant woman, identity unknown at the time of discovery, cause of death unclear, dumped in a location that suggested someone wanted her found eventually, but not immediately. Lynn's research would eventually reveal her name, Anna Lee, a young woman who had escaped from an isolated religious community in the Supai region. The case attracted minimal law enforcement attention. Another nameless victim in a region where bodies appear with unfortunate regularity. But Lynn saw inconsistencies in the official explanations, details that suggested the woman hadn't been a random victim of human trafficking or cartel violence. She'd been fleeing something, and whatever she'd been fleeing was organized, well-funded, and willing to kill to keep her silent. Lynn's research pointed toward the Supai region, toward rumors about an isolated religious community that occasionally lost members under suspicious circumstances. Getting concrete information proved difficult. The settlement wasn't on official maps. Former members were difficult to locate and reluctant to speak on record. But Lynn had developed contacts in advocacy organizations that monitor abusive religious groups, and those contacts suggested Templegate warranted investigation. The helicopter charter seemed routine. Blake had filmed from helicopters dozens of times. knew the rhythms of flight, understood how to stabilize shots while compensating for movement. The pilot reviewed the flight plan, aerial footage of the region, then landing near coordinates Lynn had identified as possible access points to Templegate's location. They were approximately 45 minutes into the flight when the helicopter's instruments started malfunctioning. Blake noticed it first, his camera's display flickering, showing interference patterns he'd never seen before. The pilot's voice came through his headset, confused and alarmed, reporting that navigation systems had stopped responding, that the engine itself was experiencing unexplained power fluctuations. Then a blinding white light flashed from somewhere on the ground, so intense it burned after images into Blake's vision, even through closed eyelids. The helicopter began losing altitude. The pilot struggled with controls that no longer responded reliably, trying to find anywhere flat enough for emergency landing in terrain that offered nothing but trees and rocks. Blake grabbed Lynn's hand, saw terror in her face that matched what he felt, understood in that moment that they might die here without ever understanding what story they'd stumbled into. The crash was violent but survivable. Trees slowed their descent, turning what should have been fatal impact into brutal deceleration. Blake's world became a confusion of snapping metal and splintering branches, his body thrown against the restraints, hard enough to fracture ribs, his camera torn from his grip to shatter against the helicopter's interior. When the movement stopped, Blake found himself hanging upside down, blood running from a head wound into his eyes. Lynn's seat was empty, harness unbuckled, her body nowhere visible in the wreckage. The pilot was dead, neck broken by the impact, his body twisted at an angle that made further examination unnecessary. Blake's cameraman instincts overcame shock. He released his harness, dropped into the helicopter's crumpled ceiling, and searched for his equipment. His primary camera was destroyed, but the backup mounted on his chest remained functional. He activated it, used its night vision to navigate the wreckage, and began calling Lynn's name into the darkness. No response. The helicopter had crashed into a ravine surrounded by dense forest. Rain was beginning to fall, cold and heavy, quickly turning the ground to mud. Blake climbed out through the broken windscreen, his broken ribs screaming with every movement, and started searching the perimeter for any sign of where Lynn might have gone. He found blood on a rock, drag marks in the mud leading away from the crash site, and footprints, multiple sets, too many to be just Lynn, suggesting that whoever had been nearby when the helicopter came down had taken her somewhere. Blake followed the trail into the forest, using his camera's night vision to navigate terrain that would have been impassable in full darkness. The footprints led to a crude path, then to evidence of structures in the distance, buildings that suggested a settlement larger than the isolated homesteads common in this region. That's when Blake saw his first glimpse of Temple Gate, and his first glimpse of what Murkoff's experiment had done to the people living there. A man hung crucified on a makeshift cross at the settlement's entrance. His body was fresh, death recent, blood still dripping from nail wounds in his hands and feet. Blake filmed automatically, documenting evidence even as horror and nausea threatened to overwhelm professional detachment. The man's face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, eyes open, mouth stretched in a scream that no longer had breath to sustain it. Blake moved closer to the settlement proper, staying low, trying to remain unseen. What he witnessed defied immediate comprehension. People moved through the streets carrying torches, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, many of them covered in blood. Some were dragging bodies toward a central pit where flames reflected off walls painted with religious iconography. Others stood motionless, staring at nothing, their faces blank except for tears streaming down their cheeks. A woman in a long dress noticed Blake before he could retreat. She screamed something about demons and outsiders, alerting others to his presence. Blake ran, his injured ribs making every breath agony. the camera bouncing against his chest as he fled down narrow alleys between wooden structures that looked like they'd been built decades ago and maintained barely. He found temporary shelter in what appeared to be a schoolhouse, barricading the door behind him and trying to catch his breath. That's when the first flashback hit him. Blake was suddenly 14 years old again, standing in the hallway of St. Sybil's School. His classmate Jessica Gray walked toward him, smiling in a way that made his teenage heart race. She asked if he wanted to study together after school, her voice tentative, hopeful. Blake started to respond, started to say yes, but Father Loudermilch appeared behind Jessica, his hand settling on her shoulder in a gesture that looked paternal but felt predatory. The memory dissolved as quickly as it came, leaving Blake disoriented and confused. He'd spent 20 years trying not to think about Jessica, about what happened to her, about his role in events that ended with her body at the bottom of a stairwell, and Father Loudermilch's voice in his ear telling him it was suicide, that Jessica had been troubled, that Blake needed to forget what he thought he'd seen. But he hadn't forgotten. The guilt had simply gone dormant, waiting for the right trigger to bring it roaring back. Blake had no way of knowing that the white flash he'd witnessed, from the helicopter, the flash that brought them down, had been more than electromagnetic interference. The signal broadcast by Murkoff's radio towers didn't just disrupt electronics. It disrupted consciousness itself, finding the deepest trauma in a person's psychology and forcing them to relive it with the vividness of present tense experience. For Sullivan Knoth and his followers, that trauma was shaped by decades of apocalyptic indoctrination, their minds filled in gaps in perception with demons and prophecy, transforming neurological interference into validation of beliefs they'd spent their lives nurturing. For Blake Langermann, that trauma had a name and a face. Jessica Gray, the girl he'd loved when he was 14, the girl who'd been sexually abused by Father Loudermilch, the girl who died when Blake was too frightened to tell anyone what he'd witnessed. The signal didn't create guilt. It just made guilt impossible to distinguish from reality. Blake left the schoolhouse. When he heard people approaching, ducking into the rainy night, and continuing his search for Lynn. The settlement was larger than it initially appeared. Dozens of buildings arranged around a central chapel, with additional structures visible in the distance. Signs of violence were everywhere, bodies in various states of mutilation, blood splattered on walls, evidence of fire and destruction that appeared recent. He found Lynn in a barn at the settlement's edge, bound to a chair, surrounded by women who were chanting in unison. Blake approached cautiously, filming everything, trying to understand what he was witnessing. The women were performing some kind of ritual, touching Lynn's abdomen repeatedly, speaking about signs and prophecy and the child within. When the women noticed Blake's presence, they scattered like frightened animals, leaving Lynn alone and unconscious. Blake freed her restraints, shook her gently until she regained awareness. Lynn's eyes opened, confused and terrified, focusing on Blake with relief that quickly became something else, a kind of warning, as though she'd seen something she couldn't articulate, something that made escape more urgent than explanation. Blake helped Lynn to her feet, started guiding her toward what he hoped was the settlement's perimeter. That's when Sullivan Knoth's voice boomed across Temple Gate through a speaker system wired throughout the settlement. Knoth announced that he had examined Lynn personally, that he had confirmed she was pregnant, that the child she carried was the Antichrist prophesied in his visions. He commanded his followers to find Blake and Lynn before the unholy birth could occur, promising that whoever brought them to him would be blessed, and that failure to comply would be punished as complicity with Satan. Blake and Lynn ran. Behind them, Temple Gate erupted into organized chaos as believers mobilized to hunt them. And in Blake's mind, another memory surfaced. Jessica Gray asking him to meet her after school. Jessica Gray telling him that Father Loudermilch had been touching her, that she didn't know what to do, that Blake was the only person she trusted. Blake promising he would help, promising he would tell someone, promising he wouldn't let anything happen to her. A promise he'd broken. A promise that haunted him with every step deeper into Temple Gate's nightmare. The question Blake needed to answer was simple. Was Lynn actually pregnant? And if she was, how had it happened in the hours since the crash? The answer would require understanding what Murkoff Corporation had built in those mountains, and why reality itself had become negotiable in the signal's radius. Chapter 3. 3 Factions, 1 Nightmare. Temple Gate wasn't a unified community when Blake and Lynn crashed into its borders. The morphogenic engine broadcast had shattered whatever fragile cohesion Knoth's authority had maintained, splitting the settlement into warring factions with competing interpretations of the apocalypse they all believed was unfolding. Understanding these factions is essential to understanding the horror Blake navigates. Each group represents a different psychological response to mass hallucination, a different way that trauma and faith combined under the influence of Murkoff's weaponized signal. The testament of the new Ezekiel represents Knoth's original followers, those who remain loyal to the prophet's teachings even as those teachings devolve into murderous paranoia. These are the people who still believe Knoth speaks for God, who trust that the visions they're experiencing validate his decades of apocalyptic warnings, who will kill anyone Knoth designates as demonic or corrupted. Marta is their champion, a massive woman who moves through Temple Gate wielding a pickaxe like an instrument of divine justice. Marta serves as Knoth's enforcer and represents everything his theology produces in its purest form. She's been a member of Temple Gate since its founding, had been among the first to hear Knoth preach in Flagstaff, had surrendered her entire adult life to serving his vision of righteous preparation for tribulation. Documents scattered throughout Temple Gate reveal Marta's psychology with uncomfortable clarity. She experienced severe childhood trauma involving abuse by family members, abuse that left her with profound distrust of secular society and desperate need for a father figure who would protect her. Knoth filled that role perfectly. He gave her purpose, identity, and certainty in exchange for absolute obedience. The morphogenic engine signal amplified Marta's existing devotion into something beyond fanatic. She experiences full psychotic delusions where she sees demons manifesting in physical form, where anyone who opposes Knoth appears as literal monster requiring extermination. When she hunts Blake through Temple Gate's streets and buildings, she's experiencing genuine religious ecstasy, the joy of serving God. Through violence, the certainty that every person she kills brings salvation closer. Marta represents what happens when faith becomes indistinguishable from psychosis, when belief is so total that contradictory evidence cannot penetrate, when devotion becomes license for atrocity. She's not hypocritical. She genuinely believes every word Knoth speaks. That absolute belief makes her more dangerous than any cynical operator could ever be. The Testament followers who accompany her share this psychology to varying degrees. Some experience full psychotic breaks similar to Marta's. Others simply follow orders without questioning, because questioning would mean confronting that they've spent decades in a cult, that the sacrifices they've made were for nothing, that the man they've trusted is either delusional or deliberately manipulative. Cognitive dissonance creates powerful incentive to keep believing, to double down on commitment rather than acknowledge error. The heretics represent those who broke from Knoth's authority when the visions became impossible to reconcile with his teachings. Their leader is Val, and her faction's story reveals the fractures in Temple Gate's foundation that the morphogenic signal exposed and widened. Val had served as chief deacon in Temple Gate, overseeing the care of orphaned and unwanted children born into the settlement. She'd believed in Knoth initially, had trusted his prophecies, and followed his dictates. when the visions began and Knoth ordered the sacrifice of children to appease God's wrath. Val carried out those orders. Documents found throughout Temple Gate reveal that she wept as she cut their throats, that she prayed over each small body, that she believed she was saving them from worse fates. She watched Knoth's followers murder children she'd raised, watched them justify atrocity with scripture, watched as prayer after prayer went unanswered, as sacrifice after sacrifice failed to stop the visions or bring the peace Knoth promised. Val concluded that Knoth was false prophet, that his God was demon-wearing holy mask, that the only path to genuine salvation required rejecting his authority entirely. She gathered followers who shared her doubts and fled into the mines near Temple Gate, establishing underground temples where they could develop alternative interpretation of the visions plaguing them all. The heretics' theology inverts Knoth's teachings. Where Knoth sees the Antichrist as ultimate evil to be destroyed, the heretics see the Antichrist as necessary catalyst for transformation. They believe the old world must be burned away completely before anything new can grow, that Lynn's pregnancy represents beginning rather than end, that protecting the child until birth serves God's actual plan rather than the corrupted version Knoth preaches. Val's faction walks naked except for crowns made of thorns and branches. They cover themselves in mud from the mines, obscuring identity and gender, creating uniformity that contrasts sharply with Temple Gate's hierarchical structure. They've developed their own rituals centered on birthing and transformation imagery, viewing Lynn as sacred vessel requiring protection at all costs. When the heretics take Lynn from Knoth's followers, they're not kidnapping her, they're rescuing her. From their perspective, keeping Lynn alive until the child is born serves divine purpose. The fact that this protection involves imprisoning her in underground tunnels while she experiences pregnancy, that progresses impossibly fast, doesn't register as cruelty. They're convinced they're serving higher truth, that Lynn's discomfort and terror are acceptable prices for salvation. Val herself is deeply traumatized by what she's witnessed and participated in under Knoth's leadership. The murders of children she cared for created profound guilt that she's channeled into her breakaway faction's purpose. Protecting Lynn becomes redemption for the children Val failed to save. The child Lynn carries represents possibility of undoing past failures through present action. The heretics are victims who became oppressors through desperation for meaning in trauma. They're not rescuing Lynn. They're using her for their own psychological needs, justifying imprisonment with theology that makes them feel righteous rather than abusive. The third faction, the Scald, represents Temple Gate's discarded. These are people suffering from an unknown illness that causes severe skin lesions and disfigurement. Knoth declared them spiritually unclean and expelled them from the main settlement, forcing them to survive in the wilderness surrounding Temple Gate. Laird Byron leads the Scald, and his faction's existence reveals the cruelty underlying Knoth's supposedly righteous community. The illness plaguing the Scald likely results from Temple Gate's poor sanitation, contaminated water, and lack of medical care. Environmental factors Knoth could have addressed, but chose to interpret as divine punishment instead. Rather than treating sick members of his flock, Knoth cast them out, promised minimal aid in the form of food and wine, then consistently delivered less than promised. The Scald have developed their own apocalyptic beliefs centered on the idea that a Messiah will arrive to heal them and transform their suffering into salvation. When Blake appears, some Scald begin to believe he might be that Messiah, that his presence signals the prophesied transformation. This belief makes Blake's passage through Scald territory unpredictable. Some aid him, others test him violently to determine if he's genuinely divine, still others attack out of conviction that any outsider represents threat rather than salvation. Documents found in scald camps reveal the psychological damage of rejection and abandonment. These people were devout members of Templegate who followed every rule, made every sacrifice Knoth demanded, and were rewarded with exile. When they became sick, that betrayal destroyed their faith in Knoth personally, while reinforcing their faith in apocalyptic Christianity generally. They still believe the end times are unfolding. They just don't believe Sullivan Knoth speaks for God anymore. The Scald represent what cults do to people who fail to serve their purposes. Religious communities claim to value every soul equally, while practicing ruthless hierarchy, where the weak, sick, and questioning are discarded without mercy. The Scald's continued faith, despite abandonment, reveals how thoroughly indoctrination can override self-preservation and rational assessment of authority. All three factions experience the same morphogenic engine broadcast. All three interpret their hallucinations through theological frameworks shaped by years in an isolated, apocalyptic community. None of them understand that their visions aren't divine revelation or demonic influence. They're neurological interference amplifying existing trauma into immersive hallucination. Blake moves through Templegate witnessing all three factions destroy each other. Testament followers hunting heretics. Heretics ambushing Testament patrols. Scald caught between both groups, trying to survive while searching for meaning in chaos. The body count rises throughout the night, violence justified by competing certainties about God's will, atrocities committed by people convinced they're serving righteousness. And all of it is being recorded, measured, and analyzed by Murkoff researchers monitoring the experiment from distant locations, watching their weaponized trauma technology prove its effectiveness on a scale Mount Massive never achieved. The factions reveal something about human psychology that Murkoff learned to exploit, give people a shared traumatic experience without shared interpretation, and they'll fracture into groups that seem irreconcilable. But underneath the theological differences, all three factions are experiencing the same thing: hallucinations induced by external signal, trauma amplified into psychosis, desperate need for meaning in suffering that feels unbearable. If they could recognize their common enemy, they might unite against Murkoff. But recognition requires stepping outside the frameworks that give suffering meaning, acknowledging that their visions aren't revelations but weapons, and that acknowledgement would destroy the belief systems that make their decades of sacrifice and suffering seem purposeful. So they keep killing each other, keep serving their versions of God, keep believing they're righteous while committing atrocities. Because the alternative, recognizing they've been manipulated, that their faith was exploited, that their entire worldview is response to weaponized neuroscience, is psychologically unbearable. Blake doesn't understand any of this yet. He's just trying to find Lynn, to survive until dawn, to escape a nightmare that keeps getting worse. His camera captures evidence of horrors he can barely process, documenting a story he doesn't yet understand, and in his mind another memory surfaces. Jessica Gray's body at the bottom of the stairwell, Father Lodermilch's hand on Blake's shoulder, the priest's voice telling him that Jessica had been troubled, that she'd taken her own life, that Blake should go home and pray for her soul, rather than making wild accusations that would only hurt her memory. Blake had believed him, or he'd been too frightened not to believe him, and Jessica's death had been ruled suicide, and Father Ludermilch had continued his position at the school, and Blake had carried the knowledge of what he'd failed to do for 20 years. The guilt was real. The failure was real. But what Blake was experiencing in Templegate went beyond memory. The morphogenic signal was taking his legitimate trauma and turning it into immersive hallucination, making him relive the worst moments of his past with such vividness that they bled into his present perception. Understanding the difference between memory and hallucination would become essential to Blake's survival. but that understanding was still hours away, separated from him by more horror than any mind should have to process. Chapter 4. The Prophet's Madness. Sullivan Knoth believes he's saving the world when Blake finally confronts him in Temple Gate's central chapel. The Prophet sits surrounded by bodies, men, women, children, all of them killed recently, arranged in poses that suggest ritual significance. Blood covers the floor in patterns that might be deliberate or might be the result of violence too chaotic to contain. Knoth's appearance suggests someone who hasn't slept in days, whose visions have become so intense that baseline reality barely registers anymore. He's writing when Blake enters, adding passages to the testament of the new Ezekiel. Recording revelations he claims God is speaking directly into his consciousness. His handwriting is frantic, barely legible, covering pages with apocalyptic imagery and divine instructions for actions that would constitute obvious war crimes if performed outside a religious context. Knoth looks up as Blake approaches. There's no fear in his expression, only certainty. He explains that he's been preparing for this moment for 40 years, that the Antichrist's arrival was prophesied, that Blake's presence proves everything Knoth taught was true. The prophet speaks calmly, rationally, using the tone of someone delivering welcome news rather than announcing plans for murder. He describes the visions he's experienced since the signal began. Children transforming into demons before his eyes. Women giving birth to monsters instead of infants. The sky itself tearing open to reveal hell's landscape underneath material reality. He interprets these visions as literal truth, evidence that the spiritual realm is manifesting physically, validation of every sermon he's preached about the world's corruption. What Knoth doesn't understand is that his visions are tailored specifically to him. The morphogenic engine signal works by identifying existing psychological patterns and amplifying them into hallucinations. For someone who spent 40 years convinced that children represent vessels for demonic corruption, the signal produces visions of children becoming demons. For someone obsessed with women's sexuality as source of sin, the signal generates hallucinations about monstrous births and corrupted pregnancy. Knoth's theology created the template. Murkoff's technology just filled in the template with experiences vivid enough to feel absolutely real. Documents discovered throughout the chapel reveal the progression of Knoth's delusions. The visions began subtly, flashes of disturbing imagery during prayer, nightmares more intense than usual, moments of dissociation where time seemed to skip forward without memory of intervening minutes. Knoth interpreted these experiences as God preparing him for coming trials, as spiritual muscles being exercised before the final battle. As the signal's intensity increased, so did Knoth's visions. He began seeing symbols in mundane events, finding prophecy in weather patterns and random occurrences. A bird flying in particular direction became message about which families would be tested next. A child crying became evidence of demonic possession requiring exorcism. Everything became omen, every moment pregnant with apocalyptic significance. Knoth's response to these escalating visions was to tighten control over Temple Gate. He increased surveillance of community members, requiring regular confession of thoughts as well as actions. He established new rituals meant to protect the faithful from demonic influence, rituals that involved physical punishment, sleep deprivation, and forced participation in violence framed as spiritual warfare. The murder of children represented Knoth's complete break from any remaining connection to ethical behavior. When his visions convinced him that children were being corrupted into vessels for demons, he commanded parents to sacrifice their own offspring to prevent demonic manifestation. He framed this command through scripture, citing Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, arguing that genuine faith requires willingness to do what seems horrific when God demands it. Many Temple Gate parents complied. They killed their children, believing they were serving God, trusting that Knoth spoke divine truth. The fact that God never stopped them, never provided the reprieve he gave Abraham, never validated their sacrifice with any sign or blessing, didn't shake their faith. It reinforced their conviction that they lived in truly apocalyptic times when even ultimate sacrifices might not be enough to earn salvation. This is where Val's break from Knoth's authority becomes completely understandable. Watching parents murder children while calling it righteous, watching bodies accumulate while prayers remain unanswered, watching a prophet demand ever greater atrocities without any evidence, those atrocities serve purpose beyond his delusions. At some point, continued faith becomes moral failure. Val's formation of the heretics represents the moment when some Temple Gate members recognized that obedience to Knoth had become indistinguishable from complicity in evil. They didn't abandon faith in apocalyptic Christianity. They abandoned faith that Knoth understood God's actual will, but Knoth's remaining followers became more devoted, not less. This psychological pattern is well documented in cult studies. When prophecies fail or leadership demands become unconscionable, some members experience cognitive dissonance strong enough to break free. Others double down, increasing their commitment because acknowledging they'd been wrong would require confronting that they sacrificed everything for lies. The parents who killed their children couldn't afford to doubt Knoth. Doubting him would mean accepting they murdered their own children for nothing, that their sacrifice was atrocity rather than righteousness. The psychological cost of that recognition is unbearable. Continued belief becomes psychological survival strategy, even when belief requires denying objective reality. When Blake confronts Knoth in the chapel, the prophet explains his latest revelation. Lynn's pregnancy represents the Antichrist's birth, the final sign before tribulation consumes the world. If the child is born, humanity falls into eternal damnation. The only way to prevent this outcome is to kill Lynn before she gives birth, to stop the apocalypse through righteous murder. Blake tries to explain that Lynn can't be pregnant, that they haven't been intimate in months, that pregnancy doesn't progress from non-existent to late term in a matter of hours. Knoth dismisses these objections as demonic deception, arguing that Satan's greatest weapon is making truth seem impossible and lies seem reasonable. There's no arguing with someone experiencing full psychotic delusion. Facts don't matter when every contradictory piece of evidence is reinterpreted as confirmation of the delusion. Knoth has constructed a belief system where anything that challenges his visions must be satanic manipulation, and that framework is impenetrable. Blake escapes the chapel when Marta arrives to drag him to Knoth's preferred method of execution. He runs into Temple Gates night, still searching for Lynn, still trying to understand what's happening, still experiencing periodic flashbacks to Jessica Gray that become increasingly difficult to distinguish from present tense events. The most recent Testament passages Blake discovers reveal Knoth's awareness that something is wrong with his visions. In moments of clarity between hallucinations, the prophet questions whether what he's experiencing might be illness rather than revelation. He describes feeling as though his mind is being invaded, as though thoughts that don't belong to him are appearing in his consciousness, labeled as divine truth. But these moments of clarity are brief, quickly overwhelmed by the signal's continued amplification of his apocalyptic psychology. Doubt is reinterpreted as spiritual attack, an attempt by demons to shake his faith at the crucial moment. Knoth concludes that questioning his visions would be the ultimate betrayal, proof that he lacks the strength to serve God's purpose. So he continues commanding murders, continues rewriting scripture to justify atrocity, continues believing he's prophet rather than victim, righteous rather than delusional, necessary rather than monstrous. Sullivan Knoth's final hours would reveal just how completely the morphogenic signal had destroyed whatever humanity remained in his psychology. But before we reach that ending, we need to understand what was happening to Lynn, and why her impossible pregnancy represented something far more disturbing than religious delusion. The question we're approaching now is the one that defines Outlast 2's deepest horror. Was Lynn actually pregnant? Or did every person who saw her pregnant body see hallucination projected by their own traumatized minds? The answer requires understanding what Murkoff Corporation discovered about collective hallucination and psychosomatic response when you broadcast weaponized trauma to an entire community simultaneously. Keep listening. We're approaching the moment where reality itself becomes negotiable, where the line between hallucination and physical fact dissolves completely, where horror transcends psychological into physiological. That's the real apocalypse. The moment when what you see and what exists become fundamentally unknowable. Chapter 5. The pregnancy that defied biology. Lynn Langermann was not pregnant when the helicopter crashed. Blake knows this with absolute certainty. They'd discussed starting a family, had decided to wait until their careers stabilized, had been careful about contraception. More importantly, Blake has been with Lynn constantly for months, living together, working together, traveling together. He would have noticed pregnancy symptoms. Lynn would have told him. Yet within hours of entering Temple Gate's borders, every person who examines Lynn confirms she's pregnant. Knoth announces it over the settlement's speaker system. Val's heretics structure their entire rescue around protecting the pregnancy until birth. Blake himself, when he retrieves Lynn from various captors throughout the night, can see her abdomen swelling, can hear her describing pain consistent with pregnancy, can witness physical changes that seem to progress from early to late term over impossible time frames. The morphogenic engine signal creates what psychiatric literature calls psychosomatic symptoms, physical manifestations of psychological states. But what happened to Lynn goes far beyond normal psychosomatic response. Normal psychosomatic symptoms might produce pseudo-pregnancy, where a woman's mind convinces her body that she's pregnant, potentially causing missed periods, morning sickness, even abdominal swelling. These symptoms are real physical experiences generated by brain signals, but they're reversible and they don't produce actual fetuses. What Lynn experienced was something else entirely. No canon document spells out a clean, scientific explanation for Lynn's pregnancy. What's clear is that the radio tower signal can cause overwhelming hallucinations and break reality testing in everyone exposed to it. When the morphogenic signal reached sufficient intensity and affected multiple people simultaneously, it could produce overwhelming, synchronized hallucinations and psychosomatic symptoms that felt physically real to everyone involved. The game never provides a clean medical explanation for Lynn's pregnancy, and most interpretations treat it as a phantom pregnancy or mass perception effect rather than a literal rewriting of biology. In other words, people around Lynn became convinced she was pregnant, and under the signal, that conviction shaped what they saw and what Lynn felt in ways that were terrifyingly convincing. The morphogenic signal found the pregnancy theme in Temple Gate's collective unconscious, Knoth's obsession with corrupted births, Val's focus on transformative child imagery, the settlement's apocalyptic fixation on the Antichrist's arrival, and amplified that theme into shared hallucination so powerful it became somatic reality. Blake saw Lynn's pregnancy because the signal affected him too. His guilt about Jessica Gray, his protective feelings toward Lynn, his fear that something terrible was happening to his wife. All of these created psychological vulnerability that the signal exploited. When Blake looked at Lynn, the signal made him see what everyone else saw: a woman in late-stage pregnancy, exhibiting all the physical signs of imminent birth. The pregnancy progressed rapidly because Under the signal, perception stops obeying normal chronology. From the believer's perspective, Lynn had been pregnant for months, and that certainty shaped how they interpreted every hour that passed. Objective time still mattered in the real world, but inside the signal's grip, their reality testing was collapsing, and the story their minds demanded began to overwrite what should have been possible. Val's heretics provided the most direct evidence of this phenomenon. They took Lynn into the underground temples in the mines, prepared elaborate rituals for the birth, and tended to her throughout labor that Blake could hear echoing through tunnels. Val spoke to the pregnancy directly, expressing possessive desire that mixed religious fervor with deeply disturbing maternal projection. She saw herself as midwife to the apocalypse, the one who would deliver the child that would transform the world. When Blake finally reached Lynn in the heretics' temple, she was experiencing what looked like genuine labor, contractions that caused visible pain, a sequence of events that resembled childbirth closely enough to terrify anyone watching. Whether any of it was medically authentic is impossible to confirm from what Blake experiences under the signal, but the horror is that it felt real. Blake had no medical training, but he'd watched enough documentary footage of childbirth to know what he was seeing matched what genuine labor looked like. Lynn herself experienced the pregnancy as completely real. She felt the fetus moving inside her. She experienced all the physical discomfort of late-term pregnancy, difficulty breathing, back pain, exhaustion. She told Blake she didn't understand how it was possible, but couldn't deny what her own body was telling her. When she looked at her abdomen, she saw what everyone else saw. The horror of Lynn's situation goes beyond physical violation. Her body had been hijacked by collective hallucination, transformed into vessel for other people's apocalyptic fantasies without her consent or ability to resist. The pregnancy wasn't something happening to her. It was something multiple traumatized minds were projecting onto her, and those projections had somehow achieved enough consensus to override biological reality. Blake's periodic flashbacks to Jessica Gray took on new significance as Lynn's pregnancy progressed. The memories became more detailed, more visceral, more insistent. Blake began remembering details he'd repressed for 20 years. How Jessica had told him Father Loudermilch had been abusing her for months. How she'd been terrified to tell anyone else because Loudermilch was respected, beloved by parents and faculty. How she'd trusted Blake to help because he was her friend, and she had nowhere else to turn. Blake remembered his response, the fear that paralyzed him, the calculation that speaking up would bring negative attention to himself, the desperate hope that maybe Jessica was exaggerating, that maybe Loudermilch's behavior had innocent explanation, that maybe Blake could avoid getting involved and everything would somehow resolve itself. Then came the memory Blake had buried deepest. Jessica telling him she was going to talk to someone herself, that she couldn't keep silent anymore, that she had evidence and was going to show it to the principal. Blake watching her walk away, feeling relieved that the burden of action had transferred away from him. The next day, Jessica was dead. The official story: suicide. Jessica had been found hanging in the school stairwell. She'd been troubled at home. Everyone knew that. The bruising on her neck matched the rope, the investigators said, though Blake would later remember inconsistencies, how the marks seemed wrong, how the staging felt off. She'd been struggling academically, socially isolated, exhibiting warning signs that, in retrospect, seemed obvious. Father Loudermilch delivered a eulogy praising Jessica's spirit while mourning that the school community hadn't recognized how much help she needed. Blake had believed the official story because believing it was easier than confronting what he suspected, that Jessica hadn't jumped, that Father Loudermilch had silenced her before she could reveal his abuse, that Blake's failure to speak up when Jessica first confided in him had made her death possible. The morphogenic signal didn't create this guilt. Blake had carried it for 20 years, had shaped his entire adult life around unconscious atonement, had become an investigative journalist exposing institutional corruption because he'd failed to expose it when it mattered most. The signal just made the guilt impossible to ignore, turned repressed memory into immersive experience, forced Blake to relive his failure with such intensity that past and present became indistinguishable. As Lynn's labor intensified, so did Blake's. Flashbacks. He'd experience minutes in Temple Gate, helping Lynn move forward, fighting off attackers, searching for shelter, then suddenly be pulled back into Our Lady of Lourdes, walking the same hallways he'd walked 20 years ago, seeing Jessica's body at the bottom of the stairwell, hearing Father Loudermilch's voice explaining why Blake needed to stay quiet. The signal was drawing parallels Blake's unconscious mind had already made. Lynn needed his help now the same way Jessica had needed his help then. If Lynn died because Blake failed to protect her, the pattern would complete, history repeating with a different victim, proving that Blake hadn't learned or grown, that he remained the same frightened person who prioritized his own safety over someone else's survival. The mines where Val held Lynn were a labyrinth of tunnels dug decades earlier, now repurposed as temples for the heretics' inverted theology. Blake navigated these passages using his camera's night vision, the green-tinged darkness revealing disturbing murals painted on tunnel walls. Images of birth and death intertwined. Pregnant figures with haloed heads. Children emerging from wounds instead of wombs. The iconography mixed religious symbolism with body horror in ways that suggested whoever created these images was experiencing reality fundamentally different from baseline perception. Val found Blake before he reached Lynn. The heretic leader moved with disturbing grace through the tunnels, naked except for her crown of branches, covered in mud that obscured features and gender. She spoke about Blake with possessive familiarity, despite never having met him, calling him witness and apostle, explaining that his role was to document the birth, to record the moment when the old world ended and transformation began. Val's psychology had fractured completely under the signal's influence. She'd broken from Knoth because she recognized his commands to murder children were evil, but she'd channeled that moral clarity into delusions equally divorced from reality. She believed Lynn's pregnancy was divine miracle, that the child would emerge with power to remake the world, that protecting this birth justified any action including imprisoning a terrified woman and forcing her through labor without medical care. Blake fought his way past heretics who tried to restrain him, finally reaching the chamber where Lynn was surrounded by Val's followers. Lynn was in clear distress, her face pale, her breathing rapid and shallow. She looked at Blake with desperation and relief, reaching for him even as contractions caused her body to convulse. Val allowed Blake to approach, explaining that he needed to be present, that witnessing was essential to the prophecy's completion. She positioned herself as midwife, checking Lynn's progression with disturbing clinical detachment, announcing that birth was imminent. What happened next remains one of Outlast 2's most debated sequences. Blake held Lynn's hand while she screamed through contractions. Val guided the birth with practiced movements, calling instructions that Lynn's body seemed to follow. And then Val reached between Lynn's legs and pulled something into visibility, something small and bloody that she held aloft triumphantly while declaring the apocalypse had arrived. Blake saw a baby, saw Lynn holding a newborn infant, saw the umbilical cord connecting them, saw evidence that birth had genuinely occurred. But underneath that perception, something else flickered. Moments where the baby seemed to vanish, where Lynn's arms appeared empty, where the umbilical cord looked like nothing more than shadow and suggestion. The signal was creating the baby the same way it had created the pregnancy. consensus hallucination so powerful, it produced what appeared to be physical form. Everyone present believed they were witnessing apocalyptic birth, and that shared belief made them see exactly what their theology required them to see. But belief, no matter how powerful, shouldn't be able to create life where none exists, and yet under the morphogenic signal, shouldn't stops being comforting. The question becomes less about what's logically possible, and more about what a weaponized mind can be made to accept as reality. Lynn looked at what she was holding. Her expression shifted from exhaustion to confusion to horror. She said something Blake would remember for the rest of his life. A sentence that contained the entire tragedy of Templegate compressed into 7 words. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. Lynn may have been right. Her words strongly suggest the baby wasn't real, or that whatever Blake thought he saw was being manufactured by the signal. At the moment of apparent birth, she experienced a brief clarity that let her see through whatever the others were seeing. In that moment, she recognized what Blake was too immersed in the signal to recognize, that her pregnancy had been delusion, that the birth was theater, that the infant everyone saw was collective nightmare rather than living child. The clarity killed her. The psychological shock of recognizing she'd experienced impossible pregnancy, had gone through real labor for hallucinated fetus, that her body had been violated by mass hallucination she couldn't resist. The horror of that recognition stopped her heart. Lynn died holding nothing, insisting to the end that Blake needed to understand there was no baby, that everything Templegate believed was delusion, that he needed to escape and tell the truth about what Murkoff had done. Blake refused to believe her, refused to accept that the infant he could see and touch was hallucination. The baby felt real in his arms, weight and warmth and all the physical sensations that should prove existence. How could something that felt this substantial be nothing? The answer lay in how the morphogenic signal exploited multiple sensory systems. Simultaneously, Blake wasn't just seeing the baby. He was feeling tactile sensations, hearing infant sounds, experiencing complete multisensory hallucination that his brain couldn't distinguish from physical reality. The signal had grown so powerful, had so thoroughly compromised his perceptual systems, that his brain filled in every detail necessary to make the hallucination feel absolutely real. Val tried to take the baby from Blake, claiming it belonged to the heretics, that they would raise the child according to proper theology. Blake fought back, protecting what he believed was his wife's infant even as Lynn's body cooled in his arms. The struggle devolved into violence, Blake using his camera as weapon, smashing it into Val's face until she released her grip and staggered backward. Blake fled the mines carrying 2 things, Lynn's body and what he believed was her baby. Behind him, the heretics' wails echoed through tunnels, grief and rage that their prophecy had been stolen by outsider who didn't understand its significance. Blake emerged from the mines into dawn light, Templegate visible in the valley below. The settlement was burning, bodies littered the streets. The factional violence had reached culmination, Testament and heretics and Scald having destroyed each other throughout the night, leaving Templegate looking like war zone rather than religious community. Sullivan Knoth's voice no longer boomed from speakers. The chapel where the prophet had made his final stand was silent, except for flies gathering on corpses. Blake descended into Templegate one last time, searching for shelter, for any indication that rescue might arrive, for some way to protect the baby, and honor Lynn's final request that he tell the truth about this place. He found Knoth in the chapel, exactly where Blake had left him hours earlier. But the prophet's posture had changed. He sat slumped in his chair, blood pooled beneath him, a knife on the floor beside his dangling hand. He'd written final testament passages before dying, pages scattered across his desk. covered in handwriting that deteriorated from frantic to barely legible. Blake read Knoth's final words while holding what he believed was Lynn's baby. The pages revealed that in his last hours, the prophet had experienced the same clarity Lynn found at the moment of birth, the clarity that let him see through the hallucinations, that revealed the truth about what he'd done to Temple Gate. Knoth's final passages acknowledged that he'd heard no divine voice, that the radio static had been just static, his own desperate mind providing words he wanted to hear, that he'd led hundreds of people into isolation and abuse based on delusions he'd mistaken for prophecy, that the children he'd commanded parents to murder had died for nothing, sacrificed to a God who never spoke, and an apocalypse that existed only in minds broken by manipulation and fear. The recognition had been unbearable. Knoth had taken his own life rather than face the consequences of what he'd done, rather than survive in a world where his 40 years of prophecy amounted to mass murder justified by hallucination. His suicide was coward's exit, convenient escape from accountability, leaving his followers to die and suffer without guidance or explanation. But it also represented the moment when reality became undeniable, when even the most committed delusion couldn't sustain itself against evidence of its falseness. Blake didn't have time to fully process Knoth's confession. Marta found him in the chapel, her pickaxe raised, her face twisted in rage and grief. She'd lost everything, her prophet dead, her community destroyed, her faith revealed as delusion. Blake represented the only remaining target for her need to make someone pay for Temple Gate's fall. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Blake had no weapons, no way to fight someone of Marta's size and strength. He ran, clutching the baby, Marta pursuing with single-minded determination. The chase led through burning buildings, across corpse-strewn streets, toward the edge of Temple Gate where Forest offered potential escape. Marta caught Blake at the settlement's border. Her pickaxe descended toward his head, would have killed him instantly, but at the final moment she stopped, stared at the baby Blake was holding. Her expression shifted from rage to confusion, to something that might have been recognition. She saw nothing. The same nothing Lynn had seen. The same nothing Knoth had finally recognized. The hallucination that had sustained her faith and justified her violence dissolved, leaving Marta staring at Blake's empty arms while he insisted he was holding an infant. The recognition broke something fundamental in Marta's psychology. She lowered her weapon, stepped backward, staring at Blake's empty arms with an expression that moved from rage to confusion to something like horror. Then she turned toward the chapel. As Blake fled, he heard the crash of collapsing structure behind him, a massive beam or crucifix falling through deteriorating walls. When he looked back, Marta lay pinned beneath the rubble, her body finally still, killed by the very architecture of faith she'd spent her life defending. Blake stumbled into the forest, still carrying Lynn's body, still clutching the hallucinated baby, still experiencing flashbacks to Jessica Gray that had become almost continuous. He could barely distinguish which reality was present and which was memory. Temple Gate bleeding into Our Lady of Lords, Lynn's death overlapping with Jessica's, Father Ludermilch's voice mixing with Sullivan Knoth's broadcast. He collapsed in a clearing as the sun fully rose, exhausted beyond endurance, his broken ribs making each breath agony, his mind fractured by trauma amplified into psychosis. He looked at what he was holding, tried to focus on the baby's face, tried to see evidence that would prove Lynn had been wrong, that there was something there. The baby flickered, appeared and disappeared, like signal interference. Blake's perception oscillated between seeing infant and seeing nothing, his traumatized brain unable to maintain the hallucination consistently anymore. Then he heard helicopters. Rescue or reinforcement, he couldn't tell which, didn't care anymore. He held Lynn's body and waited for whoever was coming to find him, to take him away from Temple Gate, to help him understand what had happened here. The final shot of Outlast 2 shows Blake cradling Lynn's corpse, his arms positioned as though holding infant, his face expressing something beyond grief or madness or relief. He's experienced total psychological collapse, unable to distinguish hallucination from reality, unable to process the compounded trauma of Lynn's death and Jessica's death, and his own complicity in both. The baby appears in his arms in the final frame. Then the screen cuts to black. No resolution about whether the infant existed. No confirmation about what Blake actually held. Just ambiguity, leaving players to interpret whether they'd witnessed supernatural birth or shared hallucination so powerful it convinced everyone present, including the protagonist. The ending never gives absolute confirmation about the baby. Lynn's last words, "There's nothing there," strongly suggest it was a hallucination, but the game leaves room for interpretation. The pregnancy reads like a psychosomatic or hallucinatory phenomenon driven by the towers, and Lynn's last words strongly suggest there was no baby. Yet the game keeps the moment deliberately ambiguous, trapping Blake inside the uncertainty. Blake Langermann left Temple Gate alive but destroyed, carrying guilt about 2 deaths 20 years apart, holding a baby that existed only in his fractured mind. His testimony worthless because nobody would believe what he'd witnessed without dismissing him as psychiatric casualty. Murkoff Corporation's experiment proved successful beyond their projections. The radio towers had demonstrated that sufficiently powerful morphogenic signal could induce not just individual hallucination, but shared delusion so convincing it produced measurable physiological effects. The implications for military application were obvious. Imagine deploying this technology against enemy populations, turning entire cities into environments where reality itself became negotiable, where people would destroy each other fighting threats that existed only in their weaponized perception. Temple Gate was never about religion. It was about testing whether consciousness could be hijacked at scale, whether human perception could be overridden reliably, whether trauma could be weaponized so effectively that victims would never recognize they were under attack. The test succeeded, the data was collected, and the victims were left to die in the desert, their suffering justified as necessary sacrifice for technological advancement. Chapter 6: Jessica Gray and the Guilt That Kills. The flashbacks Blake experienced throughout Temple Gate weren't random memories surfacing under stress. They were targeted psychological attack, the morphogenic signal identifying his deepest trauma and forcing him to relive it with such intensity that it became indistinguishable from present experience. Understanding what actually happened to Jessica Gray is essential to understanding how the signal exploited Blake's psychology and why his guilt made him particularly vulnerable to the technology Murkoff had deployed. Blake Langermann and Jessica Gray attended St. Sybil School in Phoenix, Arizona. Blake was in 4th grade, around 9 or 10 years old. Jessica was in his class. Blake was quiet, studious, the kind of student who succeeded through diligence rather than brilliance. Jessica was similarly introverted, drawn to art classes and literature, someone who seemed comfortable with solitude. They became friends through shared isolation, 2 quiet kids who recognized kinship in each other's discomfort with social performance. Their friendship was genuine but fragile, built on proximity and mutual appreciation rather than deep emotional intimacy. Blake had feelings for Jessica that he couldn't articulate, adolescent attraction mixed with protective impulses he didn't understand. Father Lutermilch taught religious studies and served as school counselor. He'd been at Our Lady of Lourdes for over a decade, beloved by parents for his dedication and by administrators for his willingness to volunteer for extra duties. Students had more mixed reactions. Some found him genuinely helpful. Others experienced discomfort they couldn't name when interacting with him privately. Jessica Gray came to Father Loudermilch for counseling after her parents' divorce created upheaval in her home life. The sessions were meant to help her process the changes, to provide spiritual guidance during difficult transition. Instead, Loudermilch used access and authority to groom Jessica for sexual abuse that began slowly and escalated over months. The grooming followed textbook patterns. Initial sessions established trust, Loudermilch positioning himself as safe adult who understood what Jessica was experiencing. He gradually introduced physical contact, hand on shoulder during prayer, reassuring hugs that lasted slightly too long, touches that felt inappropriate but were framed as paternal care. He isolated Jessica emotionally, convincing her that only he truly understood her struggles, that telling others would betray their special relationship. By the time the abuse became explicitly sexual, Jessica was too psychologically entangled to easily resist or report. Loudermilch had spent months establishing patterns of secrecy, teaching her that their relationship was sacred and private, warning that others wouldn't understand and would blame her rather than believe her accusations against respected priest. Jessica finally told Blake the truth not long before she died. She broke down during study period, unable to maintain the isolation Loudermilch had imposed anymore. She described what had been happening, showed Blake evidence, letters Loudermilch had written that were inappropriate even if technically ambiguous, photographs taken during counseling sessions where his hands were positioned in ways that suggested contact beyond what guidance required. Blake's response was exactly what Jessica feared, and exactly what his child psychology could produce: paralysis disguised as confusion. He was a child himself, too young to understand the full weight of what Jessica was telling him, too frightened of adult authority to know how to help. He believed Jessica, experienced appropriate horror and rage, but immediately began calculating consequences of speaking up. Loudermilch was powerful within the school community. Blake's parents were devout Catholics who revered priests as direct representatives of God. Making accusations would bring scrutiny onto Blake himself, would potentially destroy Jessica's reputation through victim-blaming responses common in religious communities confronting abuse by clergy. Blake told Jessica he believed her, promised he would think about how to help, encouraged her to wait before taking action, to let him figure out the best approach, to trust that they could handle this carefully rather than rushing into confrontation. Jessica waited 3 days, then decided she couldn't wait anymore. Couldn't maintain silence while Loudermilch continued having access to her, and potentially to other students. She told Blake she was going to show her evidence to the principal, that she understood this would be difficult but had to happen. Blake felt relief and guilt simultaneously. Relief that the burden of action had transferred away from him. Guilt that he hadn't been brave enough to share that burden when Jessica needed him to. The next day, Jessica's body was found at the bottom of the stairwell connecting the school's first and second floors. Her neck was broken from impact with the concrete floor. No witnesses came forward. The investigation concluded she'd fallen accidentally or jumped deliberately, with evidence supporting both interpretations, but neither conclusively. Father Loudermilch delivered a eulogy praising Jessica's sensitivity and mourning, that the school community hadn't recognized how troubled she'd been. He approached Blake afterward, put his hand on Blake's shoulder, the same gesture of false comfort he'd used to groom Jessica, and told Blake that Jessica had been struggling with dark thoughts, that Blake shouldn't blame himself for not seeing the signs, that the best way to honor her memory was to move forward, rather than dwelling on what couldn't be changed. Blake never told anyone what Jessica had revealed about Loudermilch. The priest continued his position at St. Sybil for 6 more years before transferring to another diocese. No charges were ever filed. No investigation into potential abuse ever occurred. Jessica's death was ruled accidental with possible suicide factors, and her story ended there. Except it didn't end for Blake. The guilt metastasized through his psychology, shaping decisions and relationships for nearly 20 years. He became investigative journalist, specifically to expose institutional corruption, to shine light on powerful people who abused their positions, to give voice to victims who'd been silenced. His entire adult identity was built on unconscious atonement for failing Jessica when she needed him most. The morphogenic signal found this guilt immediately. Blake's psychological profile, unresolved trauma, persistent self-blame, defensive career choices that suggested compensation for past failure, made him ideal target for the signal's amplification technology. Every time Blake experienced flashback during his night at Templegate, he was reliving authentic memory but with intensity, artificially heightened to traumatic levels. The signal took experiences Blake had spent 20 years processing and contained, stripped away all his coping mechanisms, and forced him to experience them as though they were happening in present moment with full emotional impact. The flashbacks weren't just memory, they were psychological warfare, weaponized guilt designed to destabilize Blake's grip on reality and make him more susceptible to hallucination. The parallel the signal drew between Jessica and Lynn was devastatingly effective. Both women needed Blake's protection. Both were threatened by authority figures with institutional power. Both depended on Blake to act decisively rather than calculate consequences. The signal made Blake experience Lynn's danger as opportunity for redemption. If he could save Lynn, he could retroactively undo his failure to save Jessica. But that redemption was impossible. Lynn died regardless of Blake's actions. Killed by exposure to technology he couldn't understand or fight. By pregnancy that was hallucination but produced real physiological damage. By the psychological shock of recognizing her body had been hijacked by mass delusion. Blake's trauma loop completed. He'd failed to protect Jessica. He'd failed to protect Lynn. The pattern proved what his guilt had insisted for 20 years, that he was fundamentally inadequate, that his failures killed people who trusted him, that he deserved the suffering Templegate inflicted. This is how weaponized trauma functions. It doesn't create guilt from nothing. It finds existing wounds and amplifies them until they consume entire personality, until present reality becomes indistinguishable from past failure, until the victim's own psychology becomes their most effective torturer. Father Loudermilch appears directly in Blake's final flashbacks, his face becoming interchangeable with Sullivan Knoth's, two authority figures who used religious language to justify abuse, who weaponized faith to silence victims, who relied on institutional protection to continue harming vulnerable people. The signal made Blake see that parallel explicitly, forced him to recognize that Templegate was Our Lady of Lords writ large, isolated community where authority couldn't be questioned, where victims were silenced through theology, where abuse was perpetuated through structures designed to protect perpetrators rather than survivors. Blake's final flashback sequence shows what his mind believes happened on the stairwell. Memory, guilt, and the signal collapsing into a single truth he can't escape. In that version, Jessica doesn't fall by accident and she doesn't jump. Father Loudermilch confronts her before she can report him, blocks her path, and the moment turns violent, ending with Jessica at the bottom of the stairs and a priest already thinking about how to frame it. Whether this is the literal historical record or the signal forcing Blake to relive his worst suspicion doesn't change the emotional reality. He believes he saw it, and he believes his silence helped bury it. Father Loudermilch found Blake standing there, pulled him into empty classroom, told him very calmly that Jessica had been unstable, that she'd jumped before Loudermilch could stop her, that Blake had witnessed tragedy rather than crime. He warned Blake that making accusations would destroy Jessica's memory, would turn her suicide into scandal, would hurt her family more than they were already hurting. He promised Blake that staying silent was mercy, that God would understand, that this secret was service to Jessica's dignity. Blake believed him because children don't have defenses against adult manipulation, because challenging priests felt like challenging God himself, because Blake's mind desperately wanted version of events where he wasn't witness to murder and complicit in covering it up. His child's mind repressed what he'd actually seen, let his memory rewrite itself into a more tolerable version where he hadn't been there, where Jessica's death was ambiguous rather than murder. A 9-year-old doesn't have the cognitive framework to process witnessing murder, so his brain protected him by burying the truth. The morphogenic signal stripped away that protective repression, forced Blake to remember what actually happened, to acknowledge his cowardice, to face the truth that his silence had let Father Loudermilch avoid consequences and potentially abuse other students for years afterward. That recognition that Blake had witnessed murder and done nothing, had protected murderer through silence, had carried this truth suppressed for 2 decades, was designed to destroy whatever remained of his sanity. And it succeeded. By the time Blake emerged from Temple Gate, he couldn't distinguish between memories of Jessica and experiences with Lynn, between Father Loudermilch's manipulation and Sullivan Knoth's prophecy, between the guilt he'd carried for years and the hallucinations Murkoff had broadcast into his brain. The baby he believed he was holding represented final psychological collapse, unable to accept that Lynn had died for nothing, that her pregnancy had been delusion, that Murkoff had orchestrated everything from helicopter crash to his wife's death. Blake's mind constructed the one narrative that made suffering meaningful, that Lynn had given birth before dying, that their child survived, that Blake could redeem his failures by protecting this infant. The baby was grief and guilt and trauma made manifest, hallucination so necessary to Blake's psychological survival that he couldn't recognize its falseness even when Lynn explicitly told him there was nothing there. Father Loudermilch was never charged with Jessica Gray's death. He died in 2009, 4 years before Blake and Lynn crashed at Temple Gate, his obituary celebrating his decades of service to Catholic education. If anyone else suspected what he'd done, they never spoke publicly. Jessica's case remains officially unsolved, her death still classified as accident with suicide possibility. Blake Langermann's testimony about Templegate was dismissed as trauma-induced psychosis. He'd survived helicopter crash, witnessed mass violence, experienced wife's death, and emerged holding empty air while insisting he carried infant. Mental health professionals who evaluated him diagnosed acute stress disorder with psychotic features, trauma-induced delusional thinking, possible traumatic brain injury from the crash. No investigation into Murkoff Corporation's role occurred immediately after Temple Gate. The settlement burned completely, destroying most evidence. Bodies were discovered but attributed to factional religious violence rather than external influence. The radio towers were dismantled quietly, their purpose never acknowledged officially. Blake spent months in psychiatric care, eventually recovering enough function to be released, but never fully integrating his Templegate experiences into coherent narrative. He insisted until the end of his treatment that Lynn had been pregnant, that their baby existed, that something more than religious violence had occurred in those Arizona mountains. Nobody believed him. The story was too impossible, too clearly the product of traumatized mind trying to make sense of senseless tragedy. Blake became cautionary tale rather than credible witness, his testimony discredited by the same trauma Murkoff had deliberately inflicted. That's how institutional evil maintains itself, by making truth sound like madness, by traumatizing victims so thoroughly their testimony becomes unreliable, by hiding behind plausible deniability while the people who might expose them are dismissed as psychotic. Jessica Gray died because institutions protect perpetrators rather than victims. Lynn Langermann died because corporations can experiment on human beings when their victims are isolated enough to be invisible. Blake Langermann survived, but lost everything that made survival meaningful, left holding guilt and grief and empty air while the people responsible face no consequences. The question Outlast 2 asks isn't whether monsters exist. They do. They wear suits and priest collars. They build corporations and religious communities. They turn suffering into profit and power while claiming righteousness or necessity. The question is whether truth matters when telling it requires believing things that sound impossible, trusting testimony from people whose trauma makes them seem unreliable, challenging institutions that have every resource available to discredit accusations. Blake learned the answer. Truth doesn't matter if nobody with power wants to hear it. Victims remain victims while perpetrators remain protected. And the cycle continues because breaking it would require confronting truths that comfortable people prefer to dismiss as conspiracy or madness. Chapter 7. Murkoff's Perfect Weapon. The radio towers that destroyed Temple Gate represented the evolution of research that began at Mount Massive Asylum decades earlier. Understanding how Murkoff refined the morphogenic engine into deployable weapon requires tracing the technology's development from laboratory experiment to field-tested trauma amplification system. Dr. Rudolf Wernicke created the original morphogenic engine during World War II while working in Nazi medical experimentation programs. His research focused on consciousness manipulation through combination of sensory deprivation, pharmacological intervention, and what he called lucid dreaming induction. The goal was creating interrogation technique that could extract information without physical torture, bypassing conscious resistance by accessing unconscious mind directly. After the war, Wernicke was brought to the United States through Operation Paperclip, the program that recruited Nazi scientists for American intelligence purposes. His consciousness research attracted CIA attention during the early stages of MK Ultra, when American intelligence agencies were desperately searching for mind control techniques to counter perceived Soviet advantages in psychological warfare. Wernicke's work at Mount Massive Asylum, funded through Murkoff Corporation's partnership with CIA, focused on refining the engine's ability to induce specific psychological states in subjects. The early versions were crude, large machines that required subjects to be physically restrained, heavy pharmacological doses to achieve necessary brain states, high mortality rates as minds broke under pressure the technology applied. The breakthrough came when Wernicke discovered that trauma amplification was more effective than attempting to implant entirely new thoughts or behaviors. Human minds resist external programming, defend against obvious manipulation, develop psychological defenses when they recognize attack. But trauma already exists inside the mind, has already bypassed conscious defenses, has created established neural pathways that can be activated rather than created from nothing. The refined morphogenic engine didn't try to implant new ideas. It identified existing trauma and amplified it to overwhelming intensity, forcing subjects to relive their worst experiences until those experiences became all-consuming, until present reality dissolved beneath the weight of past suffering made present. This amplification produced predictable psychological effects. Subjects lost ability to distinguish memory from current experience. Their consciousness became trapped in trauma loops, where past events repeated eternally, each repetition reinforcing neural patterns associated with fear, helplessness, and desperation. The technology essentially weaponized PTSD, taking natural human response to overwhelming experience and accelerating it to pathological intensity. Mount Massive demonstrated the engine's effectiveness, but also revealed limitations. The technology required subjects to be physically present in the facility. strapped into the device, under constant monitoring. Scaling this approach to military application seemed impossible. Armies couldn't be expected to capture enemy combatants and process them individually through consciousness-altering machinery. Murkoff's post-mount massive research focused on solving the scaling problem. How could the engine's effects be delivered remotely? How could trauma amplification target populations rather than individuals? How could the technology be weaponized for field deployment rather than laboratory use? The answer came from research into electromagnetic frequency effects on human neurology. Certain frequencies, when broadcast at sufficient power, could create measurable changes in brain activity across populations exposed to the signal. The effects were subtle: mood changes, minor cognitive disruption, increased suggestibility. But they demonstrated that consciousness could be influenced remotely through properly calibrated broadcasts. Murkoff's engineers began working on combining morphogenic engine principles with remote broadcast capability. The challenge was power. The engine's effects required intense signal strength that early radio technology couldn't achieve at distance. But advances in transmission equipment, combined with understanding of neurological vulnerabilities identified through Mount Massive research, eventually produced viable prototype. The radio tower system deployed near Temple Gate represented culmination of this research. Multiple towers arranged in geometric pattern created overlapping signal coverage throughout the Supai region. Each tower broadcast specific frequency patterns designed to induce altered consciousness states similar to those the original engine produced through physical apparatus and drugs. The signal didn't work identically on all subjects. Individual variation in neurology, psychological history, and current mental state created different responses, but Murkoff's research had identified common patterns. Trauma amplification occurred reliably across diverse subjects. Hallucinations emerged consistently, though their specific content varied based on individual psychology, and reality testing degraded predictably as signal intensity increased. Templegate offered perfect testing environment. The community was already psychologically primed for apocalyptic experience through decades of Knoth's indoctrination. The isolation meant controlled subject population with minimal outside contamination. The religious framework provided convenient explanation for whatever experiences the signal produced. Residents would interpret technological manipulation as divine revelation or demonic attack, would never recognize they were subjects in weapons test. Murkoff activated the towers gradually, increasing signal intensity over months, while monitoring population response through concealed observation equipment placed throughout Templegate and surrounding wilderness. The researchers observed predictable progression. Initial exposure produced minor symptoms, increased anxiety, vivid dreams, occasional dissociative episodes. As intensity increased, hallucinations became more frequent and immersive. At full power, the signal created complete breaks from baseline reality where subjects experience persistent delusions indistinguishable from external sensory input. The pregnancy delusion affecting Lynn represented unexpected success. Murkoff hadn't predicted that shared hallucination could produce coordinated psychosomatic symptoms across multiple observers. The fact that everyone who examined Lynn consistently reported pregnancy, that Blake, Knoth, Val, and dozens of Templegate residents all experienced identical hallucination about her condition, demonstrated that the signal could create a shared, signal-induced hallucinations beyond what individual trauma amplification should achieve. This discovery had profound implications. If the technology could make populations share hallucinations so convincingly that their bodies produced physiological symptoms matching the false perception, military applications multiplied exponentially. Imagine making enemy soldiers believe they were injured when they weren't, making civilian populations experience plagues that existed only in their traumatized perception, creating chaos where combatants couldn't distinguish real threats from hallucinated ones. The Temple Gate test also revealed limitations and complications. The signal didn't create perfectly controlled responses. Factional violence was consequence of individual variation in how different residents interpreted their hallucinations. Some subjects, like Marta, became more devoted to existing authority structures, while others, like Val, broke away entirely. The technology could destabilize populations reliably, but couldn't determine exactly how that destabilization would manifest. Additionally, the signal affected everyone in its radius, including unintended targets. Blake and Lynn weren't supposed to crash into the test zone, weren't part of experimental protocol, but the electromagnetic pulse that brought down their helicopter demonstrated that the system had side effects beyond pure consciousness manipulation. Equipment failures, physiological symptoms, in subjects not psychologically primed for trauma amplification, difficulty maintaining signal calibration across variable terrain. All of these suggested the technology remained experimental rather than deployment ready. Lynn's death particularly concerned Murkoff researchers reviewing the data afterward. She'd experienced physiological pregnancy symptoms severe enough to produce real labor despite no actual fetus existing. Her body had responded to hallucinated pregnancy as though it were real, producing hormones and physical changes that shouldn't have been possible through purely psychological mechanism. The fact that she died moments after rejecting the hallucination suggests that the physical toll of the signal, or the shock of reality breaking through, was more than her body could survive. From research ethics standpoint, this was catastrophic failure, requiring immediate program cessation and legal accountability. From military weapons development standpoint, this was promising indication that the technology could kill targets through psychological attack alone, without requiring traditional weapons that leave physical evidence. Murkoff pursued the latter interpretation. The Temple Gate test was classified as qualified success. The signal had demonstrated reliable population-level trauma amplification, consensus hallucination capability, and potential for psychological casualties without kinetic force. The complications, factional violence, equipment interference, variable individual responses were framed as refinement opportunities rather than fundamental problems. The data collected from Templegate fed into next-generation research. Murkoff began exploring how to target signal effects more precisely, how to induce specific hallucination types, rather than allowing subject psychology to fill in content, how to produce desired population behaviors, like compliance or evacuation, rather than uncontrolled violence. The implications for military and intelligence clients were obvious. A system that could act as non-lethal crowd control or a psychological warfare capability would be invaluable for counterinsurgency operations, allowing controllers to suppress populations without firing a shot. While no public marketing materials mention Templegate, the Signala facility's connection to historical CIA projects suggests the end goal was always weaponization. The settlement's destruction was attributed publicly to religious extremism, cult, violence, and mass suicide similar to other infamous cult endings. The occasional journalist who investigated more thoroughly and suggested external influence was marginally credible enough to raise questions but never provided sufficient evidence to sustain investigation. Blake Langermann's testimony should have been that evidence. He documented Templegate's condition with his camera, recorded Knoth's final confession, witnessed the signal's effects firsthand, and survived to tell the story. But his trauma made him unreliable witness. His claims about impossible pregnancy and weaponized radio broadcasts sounded like psychotic delusions, and without corroborating evidence or credible expert support, his story remained just another conspiracy theory. Murkoff ensured it stayed that way. The corporation's legal team monitored Blake's psychiatric treatment, prepared counter-narratives to deploy if his testimony gained traction, and quietly intimidated any journalist who showed interest in investigating his claims. The same resources that had protected Father Ludermilch's abuse of Jessica Gray, institutional power, plausible deniability, strategic discrediting of victims, protected Murkoff's weaponized trauma program. The radio towers near Temple Gate were dismantled within weeks of the settlement's fall. The facility where researchers monitored the test was abandoned and stripped of equipment. Documents related to the experiment were classified at highest levels, accessible only to personnel with specific clearances. Murkoff established shell companies to distance itself from direct liability, creating layers of corporate structure that would make prosecution nearly impossible even if evidence emerged. The people of Temple Gate became statistics. Bodies recovered from the site were attributed to mass violence stemming from religious delusion. The few survivors who made it out of the region alive were either too psychologically damaged to provide coherent testimony or chose silence over reliving trauma publicly. The settlement itself was left to decay, becoming just another forgotten tragedy in a region full of hard stories nobody wants to examine too closely. Meanwhile, Murkoff continued refining the technology. The morphogenic engine's evolution didn't end with Temple Gate's fall. That test simply provided data necessary for next iteration. Somewhere in classified facilities, using funding streams designed to be untraceable, researchers are still working on weaponized consciousness manipulation, still finding ways to turn human psychology into battlefield advantage, still treating trauma as resource to be exploited rather than condition requiring care. The question isn't whether this technology exists. Outlast 2 presents fictional version of documented reality. Research into consciousness manipulation has been ongoing since World War II, has been funded by governments and corporations with interest in psychological warfare. Capabilities has produced technologies whose full extent remains classified. The morphogenic engine is speculative extrapolation rather than fantasy, asking what becomes possible when consciousness research is pursued without ethical constraints. The question is, what happens when these technologies are deployed? When governments decide that weaponized trauma is an acceptable tool of warfare? When human psychology becomes a legitimate target for military operations? Do we recognize that attack for what it is, or do we dismiss victims' testimony as psychosis? Do we demand accountability from institutions that develop these weapons, or do we allow them to hide behind classification and plausible deniability? Blake Langermann learned that truth requires more than evidence. It requires audience willing to believe uncomfortable things about institutions they'd prefer to trust. He had footage, had testimony, had lived experience of what Murkoff had done to Temple Gate, and none of it mattered, because accepting his story would require acknowledging that corporations can experiment on populations with impunity, that weaponized trauma technology exists and has been field tested, that invisible warfare is being waged with human consciousness as the battlefield. Most people chose not to believe, chose the comfortable narrative where Temple Gate was isolated tragedy, caused by religious extremism rather than symptom of larger systemic evil, chose to dismiss Blake as unreliable rather than confront what his reliability would mean about the world we all inhabit. That choice is how Murkoff continues operating, how Father Loudermilch continued teaching, how institutional evil perpetuates itself across decades, and victims and obvious patterns that become invisible when acknowledging them requires uncomfortable action. The weapon works not because it's technologically sophisticated, though it is. It works because human psychology is reliably vulnerable, because trauma can be amplified remotely, because consciousness can be hijacked when subjected to sufficient neurological pressure. But it works even more effectively because the people deploying it understand that victims' testimony will be dismissed, that truth can be drowned in classification and legal maneuvering, that most people will choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable facts. Templegate fell because Murkoff wanted data. Jessica Gray died because Father Loudermilch wanted access. Lynn Langermann died because her body was turned into experimental subject without consent or warning. Blake Langermann survived, but lost everything that survival should mean. And somewhere in a classified facility, researchers are analyzing the data, refining the technology, preparing the next test, because the experiment never ends when the results are promising and the subjects have no power to refuse. Epilogue: what we carry when the nightmare ends, the question Outlast. 2 leaves unanswered is whether Blake Langermann ever escaped Templegate. Physically, he left. Helicopters arrived, he was evacuated, he received medical care, but psychologically, he remains there. Trapped in the moment when Lynn told him there was nothing there, holding empty air and insisting it was his child, unable to distinguish weaponized hallucination from reality. That entrapment was the signal's final effect. Even after broadcasts ceased, even after the towers were dismantled, the trauma they'd amplified continued defining Blake's consciousness. The morphogenic engine hadn't just attacked his mind temporarily, it had permanently compromised his ability to trust his own perception, had made reality itself perpetually questionable. Blake's story represents Outlast 2's deepest horror. Physical threats can be escaped, monsters can be evaded, immediate danger can end when you exit its territory. But psychological damage persists. Trauma doesn't stop when the traumatic event concludes. It continues shaping perception, relationships, identity, creating prison constructed from your own memories and fears. Blake will spend the rest of his life questioning what was real at Templegate. Was Lynn actually pregnant? Did he hold their baby before she died? Were the visions he experienced genuine memories or implanted hallucinations? Without trustworthy perception, these questions have no answers. He's left in permanent uncertainty, unable to mourn Lynn properly because he doesn't know what version of events to mourn, unable to move forward because the foundation of his reality has been destroyed. This uncertainty extends to Jessica Gray. Blake remembered witnessing Father Loudermilch murder her, remembered 20 years of repressed truth surfacing under the signal's amplification. But how can he trust those memories when everything else he experienced at Templegate mixed truth and hallucination indistinguishably? Maybe Loudermilch did push Jessica. Maybe Blake's guilt constructed that memory to justify feelings he'd carried for decades. Maybe the truth is somewhere between those extremes, forever inaccessible because the signal made Blake's memory unreliable. The impossibility of certainty is the weapon's lasting damage. Murkoff didn't just traumatize Blake temporarily. They destroyed his epistemological foundation, his ability to know anything with confidence. That destruction is more thorough than any physical injury, more permanent than any psychological symptom that might improve with treatment. Blake can never again fully trust his own mind, can never distinguish with confidence between perception and hallucination, can never escape the possibility that what he experiences now might be as false as what he experienced in Templegate. Sullivan Knoth experienced the same destruction in his final hours. His confession acknowledged that 40 years of prophecy had been delusion, that God's voice had been his own desperate mind providing meaning to random static. But even that recognition might have been final hallucination, the signal's cruelty producing false clarity that made Knoth doubt genuine experiences. He died uncertain whether his faith had been real or constructed, whether his life's work had been service or atrocity, whether God had ever spoken or if every revelation had been neurological noise. Val died believing Lynn's pregnancy was sacred, that protecting the birth served divine purpose. Marta died recognizing there had been no baby, that her faith had justified murders committed for hallucinated apocalypse. Both experienced the same events, interpreted them through different theological frameworks, reached opposite conclusions about what was real. The signal created multiple irreconcilable versions of truth simultaneously, ensuring that nobody could maintain confident understanding of what had actually occurred. The victims of Templegate, Testament followers who murdered children on Knoth's command, heretics who imprisoned Lynn, believing they were rescuing her, Scald who suffered abandonment while clinging to faith, all experienced trauma amplification that made them perpetrators while remaining victims. They killed, tortured, and destroyed based on hallucinations they couldn't recognize as false, making them criminally responsible for actions that were also evidence of their victimization. How do you process accountability when consciousness itself has been compromised? When the people who committed atrocities were experiencing psychotic breaks induced by external technology, when their violence was real but their perception was weaponized? Outlast 2 refuses easy answers. The Testament followers who murdered children were experiencing genuine psychotic delusions, were victims of Murkoff's experiment, had their psychology hijacked and weaponized. They're also responsible for the deaths they caused, for the trauma they inflicted, for choosing obedience over resistance even when commands required killing. Both realities exist simultaneously. They were victims and perpetrators, manipulated and responsible, suffering and inflicting suffering. That complexity reflects actual moral landscape of institutional evil. The guards at Mount Massive were perpetrators who implemented Murkoff's torture programs. They were also often military veterans with PTSD, economically vulnerable people desperate for employment, individuals whose own trauma made them susceptible to institutional manipulation. Recognizing their victimization doesn't erase their violence. Acknowledging their violence doesn't negate their victimization. The systems that create these situations, Murkoff Corporation, the Catholic Church's protection of abusive priests, intelligence agencies that experiment on unwitting populations, bear ultimate responsibility. They create conditions where victimization cycles perpetually, where traumatized people traumatize others, where suffering spreads through populations like infection, while institutions that initiated the cycle remain protected and profitable. Breaking those cycles requires confronting uncomfortable truths. That respected institutions can be engines of abuse. That technology can weaponize human psychology. That trauma is exploitable resource for people willing to disregard ethics in pursuit of power or profit. That victim's testimony deserves belief, even when acknowledging their truth requires systemic accountability. Blake Langermann tried to break the cycle by documenting Templegate, by surviving to testify, by insisting that something more than religious violence had destroyed that community. His failure to be believed represents how thoroughly institutions have immunized themselves against accountability. They've made truth require such extraordinary evidence, made victims' voices so easy to dismiss as unreliable, made challenging institutional power so difficult that most people choose not to attempt it. Jessica Gray died because institutions protected Father Loudermilch rather than investigating seriously when his behavior raised concerns. Lynn Langermann died because corporations can experiment on human subjects when their victims are isolated enough to be invisible. Templegate fell because weaponized trauma technology exists and has been tested on populations whose suffering can be attributed to other causes. These aren't separate tragedies. They're manifestations of the same fundamental dynamic. Institutional power protecting itself by making victims pay for institutional crimes. The baby Blake believes he held in Templegate's final moments represents the lies we tell ourselves to make trauma bearable. He needed Lynn's death to have produced something, needed their final night together to have created life rather than just ended it, needed to believe that suffering that profound must have meaning. The baby was grief, refusing to accept loss, guilt demanding redemption, love insisting that the person we've lost cannot simply be gone without something remaining. But Lynn told him the truth. There was nothing there. That sentence is the quiet center of Outlast 2's horror. All the violence, all the theology, all the weaponized technology, all the factional conflict, everything Templegate did to itself and everything Murkoff did to Templegate was built on something that was never real, a pregnancy that never existed, a child that was never conceived, an apocalypse that unfolded only in traumatized minds subjected to external manipulation. The suffering was real. The bodies were real. The grief was real. The trauma scars that survivors carry are real. But the story everyone believed they were living, that they were participating in final battle between good and evil, that their choices determined humanity's fate, that their sacrifices served cosmic purpose, was constructed by technology repurposing religious language as delivery system for neurological interference. Outlast 2's final cruelty is that it doesn't offer comfort. It doesn't reveal that Lynn's baby survived somewhere safe. Doesn't confirm that Blake's testimony eventually exposes Murkoff. Doesn't show institutions held accountable or technology destroyed. The game ends with a man holding empty air while clinging to hallucination because the alternative, that he lost everything for nothing, is unbearable. The nightmare ends in Temple Gate, but it continues in Blake's mind. Continues in any world where institutions can experiment on vulnerable populations with impunity. Continues wherever trauma can be weaponized, truth can be dismissed, and suffering can be turned into data point in research program. If you're listening to this in the dark, maybe trying to fall asleep while your own mind replays small failures and old regrets, there is a quiet, unsettling comfort in Outlast 2's story. The fears that haunt you at 3 a.m, the mistakes you wish you could undo, the people you think you failed, the alternate timelines you imagine where you made better choices. Those fears feel enormous inside your skull. Under the right pressure, they could grow so large they would swallow reality. Outlast 2 imagines what happens when someone learns to turn that pressure up on purpose. The game never tells you what Blake does next, whether he spends his life trying to prove Templegate happened as he remembers, whether he eventually accepts official narratives and files his experiences under psychosis, whether he finds any way to live with guilt that has been weaponized against him. It leaves him in the desert, holding nothing, surrounded by truths nobody will believe. Maybe that is the question you carry with you when you finally drift off. How do you live after your reality has been rewritten from the inside? How do you trust your mind when you know it can be turned against you? How do you hold your own memories gently enough that they do not become weapons? The answer Outlast 2 gives is uncomfortable and unfinished. You do not get certainty. You get awareness. You get the knowledge that institutions can do this and that faith, whether in God, in corporations, in medicine, in governments, even in your own perception, must always be balanced with vigilance. It is an unfair burden to place on individuals. But institutional horror has always been unfair. It asks people already hurt to become guardians against further harm. It makes survivors responsible for warning others while simultaneously discrediting their warnings. Blake Langermann never got the chance to warn the world about Templegate. Later Murkoff account material connects Pauline Glick and Paul Marion to Murkoff's mitigation work around Templegate, but the exact details of Blake's recovery are not laid out cleanly in the base game's ending. They found Blake catatonic, still clutching empty air where he believed his daughter existed, his mind completely shattered by prolonged exposure to the morphogenic signal. When you close your eyes after this, when the images of burning chapels and flooded school hallways and desert radio towers fade into the formless, shapes of falling sleep, maybe the only thing left to hold on to is this. The scariest monsters in Outlast 2 are not the ones chasing you through cornfields or mines. They are the ones who learned how to reach into a human mind and make it eat itself alive, then called the results progress. And somewhere far from Templegate, where the sand has already begun to reclaim the burned wood and broken crosses, they are still taking notes,